Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Justin Harper. The podcast takes a considerable amount of work, so we really do appreciate everyone's contribution. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. For as little as $3, you can get access to our Discord community where hosts Ikoi, Hero and myself host weekly live discussions, so come join us. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And this week's random call out goes to patron Marissa.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
What has happened in the United States with the looming abortion prohibition, since the Supreme Court has had a leak that they would vote against abortion rights and withdraw Roe versus Wade that legalized abortion, is that Americans have mobilized the way they haven't recently or for the last 50 years. And I think what happened is they recognized what's happening, which is the Republicans have been building a legal lattice work so that they can climb down that legal ladder into fascism. And fascism is impossible if the mass of people who are being cheated by capitalism are united. And so they create hierarchies. Women are below men and should serve men. People of color are below white people and should serve white people. And the little advantages of whiteness and maleness should be enough of an incentive for men to oppress women and white people to oppress black people and black people to mistrust and hate white people and brown people to mistrust blacks and whites and so on. That's the way empires work. That's what the British did when they came to places like Guyana or Kenya. They imported people from India to be lower than whites, but the administrators of blacks to create hatred. In Guyana, they turned the blacks against the Indians very successfully because of the whole colonial history. And they create these hierarchies, which they have done by gerrymandering and altering election districts so black people can't vote, from removing polling places in black areas, from creating huge waiting periods for black people to vote, from creating more and more documents that blacks may not have so that they can qualify to vote, dropping them from the voting lists, and creating a hierarchy. And that hierarchy includes a sexual hierarchy because women bear children. Women's reproduction is a way of demeaning us. That was very nicely shown this week, where Elon Musk, the richest man in the world with $200 billion, has just been exposed by somebody on his space airway who he propositioned. He had trained massage people as people who were flight attendants. And in the massage, he wanted to have sex with this woman. And not only did she demur, she refused, but she told a friend who has exposed this. Once she refused, she stopped her job, changed radically. She wasn't hired for the flights anymore the way she had been. There was punishment because a rich person and a man has sexual and supremacy over a woman. Because his sexuality should be untouched. That's why in the United States, men's birth control, condoms have never been prohibited. Viagra is covered by all the insurance companies, whereas birth control and abortion are covered by few, not by many, because this is a way that you create hierarchy. Religion sanctifies this, and the majority of people on the Supreme Court now are Catholic. and Catholicism bans abortion. In Chile, they recently got abortion rights, even though it's a Catholic country, just like they did in Argentina. The Pope himself went to Chile to try to get them not to support abortion rights, but they did. And they did because they were unified. The labor unions, labor, joined with feminists, joined with indigenous people who were trying to get some kind of land settlement and the lack of prejudice. Those are brown people, united with the climate extinction people who are fighting to save the climate, united with socialists, and they won. And that was the same coalition that won in Argentina. It won abortion rights in Argentina, and it won socialism, including abortion rights in Chile. That kind of unity is what they are trying to prevent. And that kind of race hatred is what is being encouraged in replacement theory, which informed the latest killer who murdered 10 Black people in Buffalo and wounded 3 others, inspired by the idea that Black people are trying to replace white people on Earth, and therefore they should be extinguished. And that is promoted on right-wing media. It's certainly not promoted by socialist media or by any of the groups I mentioned in that unity, whether they are labor unions or climate activists or Black Lives Matter people or socialists or communists or anarchists. No. And so that we are facing a threat in America. And I think the leak of the abortion ban has really mobilized people. In New York City, 2 days ago, there were huge demonstrations, and high school students were there, middle school students, older women who had fought this before, like me, and middle-aged women, Republicans, Democrats, Blacks, whites, women, men, because they saw and they felt the threat. So that's what I think this is about. What are your thoughts about it, Ikoi? I know you've thought about it too.
This has been an area that I've been active in since, I would say, like my early teens.
Mhm.
A huge, I don't know if anybody remembers the Becky Bell case out of Kentucky in the 80s.
Yes.
It became a lightning rod conservative issue with the moral majority, and it really wasn't before then. That this was a, very concerted, they figured this would be a very good, cultural political issue to take up.
Can you explain a little about that for our listeners who may not know about it, that Betty Bell case?
So the Becky Bell case was one of the first parental notification cases. So this was one of the, abortion rights have been chipped away throughout my lifetime. So this ban is not a sudden thing. It has been, decades long active chipping away of rights. So one of the major first steps has been about parental notification.
Mm-hmm.
And so Becky Bell accessed what looks to be a not medically, appropriate abortion because she didn't want to have to notify her parents.
Mm-hmm.
And she died. And this was, let's see. So yeah, this was 1988.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this is, from Wikipedia. But after becoming pregnant, Bell inquired about a legal abortion, but was hindered by Indiana. Okay, so it's Indiana state law, which required either her parents' consent or a waiver from a judge. Mm-hmm. Instead, Bell either obtained a legal abortion or attempted to self-abort, leading to a fatal infection. Mm-hmm. The coroner found that Bell died of sepsis as a consequence of an unsterile abortion, a finding that has been disputed by the anti-abortion movement. Following Bell's death, her parents have become advocates for the repeal of parental consent laws.
That's really important. It's also important that in Indiana And in Kentucky, there were huge demonstrations for abortion rights. There were big pictures of a mass of people in Louisville, Kentucky, which is not a state that advocates abortion rights, because people have been activated by the repeal of rights. There are 5 basic systems in a human body: the circulatory, the muscular, the digestive, the respiratory, and the reproductive system. What they want to do is have one of those systems, the reproductive system, owned by the state and the males in charge, making women 4/5 of a person, having control of only 4/5 of our systems. And it is there for every fascist government, whether it was Franco or Mussolini or Hitler or now Orbán in Hungary, that this is one of the early things that they do to divide people and so that they cannot unite and change their situation the way they have recently, just within the past year in Argentina and in Chile. And in order to do that, they make women subordinate by their role as mothers and their reproduction system. That's why, even though women in the United States now get 82% of what men earn for similar jobs or for jobs in general, Black mothers get 44 cents of the male dollar, and white mothers 69 cents of the male dollar when they work. Because if you're a mother and the system of creating children and caring for them is something that is on your mind, you are automatically fined. Mothers make when you become a mother in the United States, you lose approximately $18,000 a year in salary, because they want to make that whole sector, which is the most humane, loving sector, depressed and devalued. Because under fascism, there's no place for that. Creature kindness, the ability to, for free, give the gift of yourself to someone else and your care for the satisfaction of caring and the joy in watching the other flourish. That is the opposite of capitalism, where you see the other person as a chance to exploit them, give them less, get more for yourself, and make money. And that's what's coming to a head now in the United States, I think. Do you see that?
I think I do. I mean, I think it's, a huge trajectory towards it's a form of a class war. The drug war has always been a form of a class war. And abortion rights, and a lot of people don't often make this connection, and it's a really unfortunate one because it's a vital one. But one of the major differences, I think, that is happening in terms of, and it's a contrast to, because we also have a lot of clamor in terms of a popular desire for criminal justice reform in general, right? So in the background of that kind of clamor, it is really interesting that some of the major shifts that have happened in terms of focus and policy-wise in the abortion debate has been like prior to when, before Roe versus Wade, like women, the actual women were less criminalized. The legal hammer fell a lot more on the hospitals and the doctors prior to Roe. So women clearly risked their physical lives.
Their lives, yes.
Right, yes, but they were not necessarily risking, prison.
Their license, right.
Right, for abortion. And that is the major shift that has changed, especially, and this is where like the drug war really comes in, because one of the ways to, the drug war is a huge aspect of it. Abstinence only education has really, unfortunately, shifted some of the terrain, I think, because, a lot of times when people don't understand a lot of physical and medical changes and issues and information, that those things can manipulate people's perceptions of these bodily,
Yes.
um, laws that apply to the human body. So one of the major aspects of, generally speaking, in the United States, if you ask, like, should abortion be legal, the majority do support the
Yes.
general concept, right?
80% do. According
Right.
to the statistics, 80% do.
Right. The detail where
Mhm.
people start really diverging, right, is in the details. The devil is always in the details, and that is where the conservatives have been really good at
Yes, chipping away. That's right.
Right. So one of the major trajectories in the chipping away and the erosion of, abortion care in the United States has been, and this is the one that's closely related to the criminalization of women for abortions,
Mhm.
and for pregnancy to a certain degree, is the fetal personhood trajectory.
That's right. And it's strange because they don't claim an egg is a chicken. They don't claim an acorn is actually an oak tree. And yet they claim that a fetus is a human being. And part of it is what you say, it's the ignorance. There are only 17 states out of 50 that have biologically accurate birth control information that they teach their students. 17 out of 50. And there are no states where the state mandates that they teach birth control in the context of relationships between people and making decisions about whether you want a child or not, how to please yourself, how to please other people. That's what they do in many other countries of the world, all over Scandinavia, the Netherlands, France, really. But we have a cultivated ignorance, which is part of what you say. It allows that kind of misinformation and chipping away at women's bodily autonomy. A lot of the signs that were in the demonstrations I was in were pictures of women's uterus and their ovaries saying, "Stop the steal," because they're stealing control, which I thought was brilliant, because what they're doing is stealing control over our bodies. And I thought that was very dramatic. And people are waking up in spite of their chipping away and in spite of their misinformation and disinformation and deliberate disinformation. It's the disinformation of replacement theory that is in the right wing internet that says that Black people are trying and people of color are trying to replace Americans in the United States. There's no factual basis to that at all. But it's
Right.
promulgated, just like that abortion is murder, is just like acorns are oaks. Oh yeah, that is promulgated. Also, we should say that in the big division between wealth and poverty, women who have the money have always gotten abortions. Go to your
Right.
private doctor who helps you.
Abortion care is not required even for
Mhm.
OBGYNs
That's right.
to learn.
That's right. It's part of the
Um,
repression of that
right.
right of us.
So the last decade I have, heard of doctors talk about, well, like, emergency. Like, I would think it's funny, when I was in Japan and I went to the OBGYN there, and I was kind of, discussing this issue with them. And like the doctor almost fell out of his chair, like literally, when I told them that, abortion care wasn't required for OBGYNs, that the
Here.
training was not part of, the regular required part of the curriculum. And
Right.
also for emergency care, right? That it should be a required part of the curriculum, because people show up to emergency rooms with miscarriages. And the process is very similar. So doctors have occasionally talked about like, oh yeah, like we had to scramble to find somebody that knew what they were doing because none of us were trained.
Women who are wealthier have always had access to abortions and still will. They consult their private physicians and something's set up either in the private physician's office, or people go to Puerto Rico or other places, or,
Right. Right. I mean, it's one of those things where, like, even if Roe is overturned, that doesn't mean that abortion is illegal in the United States. It just goes back to the states.
Right.
Right.
And that means that it's illegal in many states, and women who are poor to travel will have unwanted children.
Right. Right. So I mean, I just want to be specific about these, just so people are more informed of what's going on. So yeah, that's also one of the some of the policies that are surrounding the new, kind of anticipating the overturning of Roe versus Wade are some of the policies that are trying to fine and criminalize people leaving the state to access abortion, right? And people helping others to leave the state. Yes, so it is not just a criminalization of the women, but also people that would be helping them.
That's right.
Friends and family. I believe is it Texas where there.
That's right.
There's several laws.
Texas and now Oklahoma, where people who are aiding and abetting abortions can also be arrested. Of course, abortions will always take place as women will die, and more poor children will be born and neglected, and more parents will be desperate and take any job at any wage. That's another thing that gets the Republicans upset. They want people to work under any circumstance, which is why Trump wrote with the meatpackers' advice. Actually, they wrote the draft, the rules that insisted that people continue to work tightly pressed in meatpacking plants, even when they got COVID by the thousands. You get a government for the rich, and you oppress people as much as possible so that they have no choices. And I think what they have in mind is what I'd call a fascist feudal family. It's what they had in Germany, in Nazi Germany, where they had a rule that women were to serve men. That was their primary function. Childbearing and serving men, Kirche, Kuche, and Kinder, kitchen, church, and children. That was women's realm. But they still all had to work because the munitions factories needed workers. It's just that they could get only a fraction of the pay because that wasn't their true vocation, working. And ironically enough, in spite of their forbidding birth control, that was criminal to have birth control, and of course, criminal to perform abortions, they didn't have a population increase because women were so exhausted that they couldn't get pregnant. I mean, this is a horrible oppression of half the population that is in store here. And the rich can always escape. They can buy their ways out. They always did. And even if they're not rich, if they have a private doctor and they can scrabble together $600 or $700 for this, a lot cheaper than having a childbirth, then they're okay if they can get together that much money.
90% of counties do not have a provider. So
that's right.
Technically speaking, to a certain degree, like, abortion in terms of like real access
as a healthcare measure.
Yeah, is to a certain degree like de facto inaccessible for a huge number of people already.
That's right.
As it is. And again, like the major changes that are happening is the actual criminalization of women.
Yes.
Especially with the fetal personhood, direction that the that has been taken in the chipping away of Roe has been that, a lot of it comes from, the drug policies and drug panic around women and drug use.
How does that work? Can you make the connection for us?
Right. So, there was a crack baby panic in the 80s, a meth baby panic in the 2000s, but judges have become very draconian in applying a felony charge known as chemical endangerment, right?
Yes.
So it was initially intended for kids that were, say, injured when they were playing near backyard meth labs, right?
Mm.
Kind of, but it has been applied to women who are using drugs by you are delivering chemical endangerment through your umbilical cord.
Right.
Women, especially pregnant women who use drugs, are an extremely stigmatized population.
And the rich are not included.
No.
Yes.
But, so it's one of those things where, this has been a very easy way to erode a lot of, the bodily integrity issues surrounding the abortion debate by using a lot of drug panic and using, one of the most vulnerable populations, obviously. These are women that need help. These are women that need treatment. Criminalization generally ends up, preventing women from accessing not just help, but basic medical care, so prenatal services, and there has also been reporting requirements that have been a huge part of drug policy around, a lot of states, if women go and access prenatal care, if testing comes back, positive for drugs, that the providers are required to report that.
Right. And criminalize those women unless they're private obstetricians. It's interesting. Your private obstetrician who wants you as a private client would not do that. But if you go to a clinic,
not just a clinic. If you are going through an insurance policy,
right.
If you are paying cash, maybe you may be able to avoid this. But if
you're a private patient, excuse me, the doctor would have to inform the insurance company, and private obstetricians and gynecologists don't want to lose a patient. So there's things they don't report. I have a client who's a wealthy woman and was a meth addict. But when she was pregnant, it wasn't reported. She's very wealthy.
Right. But, and again, also, probably not having to access insurance, right? She was probably a cash patient. That definitely helps, because a lot of times, doctors are like, well, if I don't report and somehow this gets out, that is medical fraud, in addition to various other things, so there are a lot of physician, provider and interests to report.
Well, I do know, because I know about the battered child legislation, that they had to change it to mandatory reporting, because when doctors had the choice, private patient, they didn't want to lose their private patients. So they didn't report child abuse, even though bones were broken and bruises were evident. So they had to make it mandatory and punishable not to report it.
Right. Well, mandatory reporting, whether it's for mental health or medical professionals or teaching, it is one of those laws that makes sense on paper in many ways, but it does definitely have a chilling effect.
Yes, it does, because people without money can't escape it, and people with money can.
Well, and it's also, a huge element. So there is a definite class element to all these things.
Definitely.
But it's also one of those things where, like, we don't have a good foster care system.
No.
Right.
Terrible.
And so it's one of those things where, once you start considering a lot of factors, like, a big part of why there can be such hesitation to report abuses like child abuse is because, the alternative is not necessarily better.
That's true. But there's also this huge difference between the experiences of the poor and the wealthier, because part of the fascistic idea is to punish poor people for being poor. It's like what they're considering in New York under Adams, who puts the police on everything. He's our mayor, is punishing people for being homeless. That's crazy.
Right.
It's also stupid because it costs, I saw in the paper, it costs $600. I mean, $600,000 to put somebody within the prison system for a year. That's crazy.
I mean, it is a lot less expensive to, treat people and provide them with care over
Yes.
incarceration, but also, like, there is a profit element in the prison industry.
Yes.
Not just in private, I mean, the private prison industry is still not necessarily the majority of the prison industry. Most of the prisons are still run by the state, but there are a lot of industries that are adjunct to people that provide the supplies and whatnot. But those
yes.
are definite huge profit
Sales of
incentive.
weapons and I know I had a client who was a therapist for recently released offenders and went to some of these conventions where there were endless tables selling tasers and security vests and all the rest. There's huge industries around incarceration.
Right. And it's also a captive labor force in a lot of
Yes.
ways, right? Especially, for example, it's really unfortunate that, prisoners that get firefighting training, because they are, required to be firefighters and fighting a lot of, wildfires, as well as, the major, during the fire season in places like Colorado and California.
That's
But
right.
oftentimes, when they leave prison, they have gained all this job experience. Many of them would like to, go into being an EMT or a firefighter, and yet, because they have, they were trained for it, right?
Right, and they do not allow them
No.
get credit for their training. But also within the Constitution, they do allow slavery under certain circumstances. And for the incarcerated, they do allow slavery. So people can work for industries that make wild amounts of money while they are paid almost nothing because
Right.
they're in the penal system. Because
Right.
that's the loophole in the Emancipation Amendments.
Right.
You really have a class system here, which is also enforced through racism and sexism.
But one of the statistics that a lot of people don't know is that the incarceration rate for men has been decreasing to a certain degree, but women's incarceration has increased between like 1980 and 2020. It has increased by more than 475%.
Really? Wow.
Right. So in 1980, the number of women in the the prison system was 26,326. And in 2020, now it's 152,854.
God.
And a huge part of the drive that has sent women to prison has been on drug charges.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also definitely why there is a very specific concern for people, that work within the population, that these criminalizations do often mean that, some of the most vulnerable populations not
Yeah.
only, end up without care, but, with a permanent, I mean, the record and the history of having gone to prison, often makes people vulnerable to economic poverty for life.
Right. Because they won't hire people. People don't get jobs
Right.
if they have a prison record. It's one of the things they ask on a job application. Have you
Right.
ever had a felony? Have you ever been imprisoned? And if you have, you're eliminated. No matter
Right.
if you've paid your price, you've gone to prison, it doesn't matter.
Right. So it is one of the major aspects of the huge trend, not just towards criminalizing providers, but criminalizing women, is this
Yes.
hugely expanding women's prison population. And we have had, and one of the aspects that a lot of people don't necessarily think about in terms of thinking about abortion has been that if when you criminalize abortions, it also makes miscarriages
Right.
suspect and up to
Yes,
investigation.
that's right. Because you're suspected of self-aborting.
Right.
There is a part of the right-wing trends that have started developing in the United States include acute misogyny, hatred of women, from the incels who advocate and admire people who kill women, like Elliot Rogers at UCLA, who killed
No,
those.
though he was UC Santa Barbara. That was UC
Oh,
Santa Barbara.
oh, that's right, UC Santa Barbara, excuse me, who killed those co-eds and other men who kill women. That there is a sense that women's sexuality belongs to men, and if they don't provide it, they should be killed. That is a fascistic notion. And that's also male entitlement, i.e., Elon Musk and the flight attendant. By the way, once she complained, they gave her a $250,000 settlement and a non disclosure clause. But the non disclosure clauses don't really hold up, as Stormy Daniels and Trump kind of showed us. And she just was blacklisted then and not given jobs. That there is part of the fascistic oppression of women and the creation of hierarchies to divide the population is that women's sexuality is owned by men. And you can see that on a daily level. Young women in New York can be heckled and commented on their sexuality by the most oppressed homeless man who still feels entitled to judge a woman who walks by. There is a kind of sexist misogyny entitlement that is fascistic. And that has been part of America's inheritance and is now, as the country polarizes into people who have a liberatory idea of equality and unity and a fascistic idea of creating superiority and inferiority and greater wealth and poverty, those lines are being drawn very sharply. I think that's one of the reasons that there have been an enormous number of demonstrations all over the United States against the leak of the possibility of dropping Roe v. Wade.
One of the key things that I remember, Ikoi has mentioned in the past when it comes to drug treatment and stuff like that is like you just want to give people as many options as possible. And
yes, and let them choose.
Yeah, and I think it's the same thing here, isn't it? It's like, why
Yes.
are options being limited? That seems bizarre. And then I think it pretends to be a moral argument, but that's not really what it is.
They make it a moral religious argument, and they call themselves the right to life rather than forced birth movement, which is much more accurate. But I think I noticed at the demonstrations in the United States and the pictures of I couldn't attend all of them, there were too many, but that they were very mixed with men and women. And so I think your perspective
Right.
as a man is important here too.
The one demographic change that I have seen has been one of probably in terms of men, right?
Mhm.
The one of the strongest allies for reproductive rights in coming from men have been gay men for a very long time.
Yes. Well, that makes
They,
sense because
yeah,
part of the biology as destiny is used against them, against gay people and trans people, so that
right.
they're tarred with the same right wing brush.
Right, but that has changed quite a bit. There has been studies that that demographic has changed. Younger gay men do not see are not necessarily for abortion rights in the kind of numbers that would, and I think a huge part of that is also the abstinence only education that we've had for the
Mm.
last several decades, right? There are some key demographic changes that I think need to be thought through in terms of this issue, because another aspect is anti-abortion movement has been strongly associated with Catholicism,
Yes.
and hence a lot of Latin American countries having uh, a lot of restrictions about reproductive rights because of the Catholic influence in their laws. But one of the major, but that has changed in that
Yes.
some of the more vocal and more extreme elements of the anti-reproductive rights movement has now switched to evangelicals.
Yes, it has, because
It has.
and those gender
And
lines are much more sharply drawn. However, Mexico has now legalized abortion. Chile has, Argentina has.
right.
So, in
I
spite
mean,
of
access
the
in Mexico is still a little bit. It basically no longer it's kind of what we would have if Roe was overturned. In that it's up to the states. It's no longer like a general countrywide ban.
Mhm.
But it's progress,
It
right,
is.
for
For
Mexico.
them, it's progress. For us, it's going backwards. But for them,
Um,
it's progress. And look, the
right.
majority of the Supreme Court is now Catholic. And I think that has an effect. And evangelical Protestants have taken that up in the Conference of Men and Women, which was adopted in the 1920 Southern Baptist Convention on Men and Women, which still holds women are to be subordinate to men. That's supposed to be enforced. And they are the
Well, I mean,
biggest
that is
Protestant
kind of a
denomination.
right. I mean, that is kind of a general conservative
Yes,
ethos.
it is. But I did notice at these demonstrations, in both the pictures from around the United States and the ones in which I participated, that men were everywhere. It wasn't majority men, it was majority women. But I would say about a quarter to a third of the participants were men, younger men, older men, men wheeling strollers, and so on. That's something that in the 1960s demonstrations that I was on, we didn't have. That's a real change in the demographic. And also, another change is people were younger. There were so many 13 and 14, 15-year olds. Kids, even in middle school, were there, which wasn't so in the 60s and very early 70s at our demonstrations. Because I think that the younger population, younger Americans realize that the American dream, that the door to opportunity is closing on their fingers, and they're much more radical and aware of that than they used to be. And they see this as another door closing. Like Liam was saying,
Right. I mean, ultimately, that is my general leaning on most topics is that people having more options
mm-hmm,
is a good thing. People having more access to various people being central to their life and a central decision making to their own care
Yes.
is a vital ethos that I have. So yeah, I think it's also one of those things where, like, back when, I think maybe, like, I would say, I mean, especially in the 60s and 70s, like, parents didn't take their kids to protest. It just wasn't,
Just me. I mean, I did.
I mean, a lot of times, it just was like less of a thing that was common. And now it is a lot more. It has, I think, 80s kind of, started to change, see a shift in that. Like, I remember, the first protest that I went to was like saving Walden Pond. Back in, that was like, my friend's parents were into that, and so, like, I showed up with them and handed out donuts to people. But but I think that was kind of like the beginning of seeing a lot more. Like, I think protests were kind of a lot more students, like,
Yes.
college students and adults prior to, and I think in the last 20 years or so is when I did start seeing, actually, a lot more, like, pre-college children.
Yes, I think it's
at
also
protests.
it's important what you said, Ikoi, which is that people should have decisions, and it's what Liam said too, about their own care. And what has happened in the right wing is people are encouraged to have the decision to own a gun and use it, and to be unmasked in public, even if they might be a health risk. That whole "what are my rights" has been shifted from a right to choose among different ideologies in government, like among socialism and capitalism, a right to health care, a right to child care, a right to a well-paying job. And those things, there's a marked split between the huge influx in the union movement in the United States, where people have a right to a decent salary and health care and pensions, versus a right not to wear a mask in a crowded airplane. That there has been this strange divergence of rights which have been pushed by the right wing, that your right is to personally do what you want, endangering other people.
It's an individualizing, framework that is consistent on their end, at least, right?
Well, isn't it individualizing to choose? I choose an abortion. I choose to have a child. Isn't that an individualized thing too?
Well, because the right point of the rights framing of abortion being murder, that
Yes.
that is a child.
Yes, it's
right. That you don't have the right to kill people. That is, and since that is a child, that is so whether that is inside your body or not to the conservative ethos is irrelevant.
You do have a right to kill somebody who's trying to enter your apartment without your permission. And they're going towards giving people the right to run people over if they're in demonstrations. But the right, this rights debate.
But it's also it's there is, you do not have. So a lot of the concept of responsibility in conservatism is around the nuclear family.
That's true.
Right. It is not about people outside the nuclear family. Like, the reason that you are allowed to kill somebody, although that depends on the legal case, of people coming in and breaking into your house, is because you are protecting the family. Right. I mean, whether even if it's, by yourself, like, then you are a family unit of one as a single adult. But, it's still, right. And it's a defense of property.
Couldn't you make the same thing, though, that, like, this fetus is breaking into my body,
yes,
breaking into my life,
and
it's breaking into my
right? Well, but if you take the religious argument that, like, God put life there. God's plan for you is more important than,
Sure.
I mean,
But there, your
it,
individual decision doesn't make much difference. And part of Toni Morrison gave a very good talk at a graduation in one of the last years she was alive, saying we have to watch out for the rationales of faith, family, and faux morality, because those are fascistic. And that's what they do. But I think you're right. Property is one of them.
I have an open question, though, in regards to faith-related things, because as far as I understood it, to actually know the will of God is blasphemous to begin with. So the idea that that God put babies here or life here in the first place, how did you come across that knowledge? Who told you? And how can you know it came from the source, as it were?
Well, that question is often not answered because the evangelical religions, unlike Catholicism or Judaism or other religions, you don't have to go to a divinity school. You get the Spirit. God enters you and tells you this is your mission. And so you don't have to be educated. And so you become a voice of God, and you're able to claim that.
Right.
And so that is their rationale, that they know.
It's pretty convenient, isn't it?
Very, very convenient. I was on the subway some months ago when the subways weren't so dangerous in New York, and some guy was screaming, God wants you to do this, and God wants you to do that. I was trying to read, so I said as loud as I could, God wants you to shut up. And everybody laughed. I mean, because who the hell are you? So that both of those things, the right wing wants to say that their voice is the voice of God. But anybody could claim that. And yet that is what evangelism is based on, that you get personally transformed, you get born again.
It's the ancient form of being a celebrity.
Yeah.
Not to sort of dismiss anyone's religious beliefs here, but just that idea of I am special. I am the chosen one. It's the same. It has shades of being famous. Yeah.
But I had an incident last time I was on the subway. It's very interesting, or one of the last times, because now it's very dangerous in New York, the subways. But there was another one of these preacher types with a big cross and a cup, of course, because he wanted to collect some money, saying God this, God that. And a young, sort of muscular Black woman got up in his face and said, "That's shit. That's just shit." And the religious guy said, "She's only saying that because she's a lesbian." And my husband got up and said, "Well, I'm a lesbian." Then I got up and said, "And I'm a lesbian." Everyone in the car, but one young Black woman with her son, got up and said, "I'm a lesbian." And another guy said, "Brother, you lost the people." And that guy left the train. But it was a reflexive opposition to this whole faux morality that was very impressive. It really was very impressive to see everybody get up. And I asked the young woman who didn't stand up, the only one, afterwards, and I said, "How come you didn't stand up?" She said, "I was with my son and I was afraid there'd be violence and I wanted to protect my son." So she was scared. But there wasn't violence because the guy was totally defeated. And I think that kind of spontaneous thing, which my husband started by standing up and saying, "Well, I'm a lesbian." That was particularly comical. He's never been mistaken for lesbian. It struck a chord with everyone. Who the hell are you to do that to that man? How can you say that about that young woman who's tired of your claiming that you know what God wants? So that, there are both voices. And I think it's a tiny minority voice as far as this country who believes that. They did these surveys. 80% of people think that Roe versus Wade should last. That
Right.
it's a tiny minority with a load of money.
It is a tiny minority with a load of money, but I don't think we can depend on that.
No, we
Because a
can't.
lot of people, you start asking details, a lot of people that will say that they're pro-choice will still think that the 6-week cutoff is fine.
Right, even though most people don't even know they're pregnant after 6 weeks.
Right. So, but, it's also like a misunderstanding again of like, what that 6-week means, because you
Right.
ask a lot of people, they think you have 6 weeks from once you find out.
Right, rather than 6 weeks from gestation, where you don't, this one period and you don't even know.
Right. And so, a lot of people misunderstand, and a lot of things are written to be easily misunderstood.
Yes, they are. And it's a,
but it is one of those things where ultimately, a lot of people, I think, have one, I mean, it is such a stigmatized topic.
It is, and it was brought up originally. This case is brought by Mississippi, which is the poorest, most backward state in the whole, out of all the 50 states. There are many competitors, but it is the least, it has the lowest level of education and so on. And that is typical. It isn't the more sophisticated border states like California or New York that is bringing this up or that wants these restrictions, because the American education system is also implicated, which is evident that there's only 17 states that have biologically correct sex education and none that have a mandated relational education with sexuality as part of relationships. It's
right. Well, it's also one of those things where I think, the one thing I really hate, to be honest with you, kind of like these, labeling certain states as backward. I think their leadership may be backward.
It's true. The people are mobilized to fight the leadership.
Right. But it's one of those things where, like, to a certain degree, like, some of the reasons that a lot of issues don't get traction in certain areas is also because, like, poor people, as if you've been subject to the welfare state, you hate the welfare state.
Yes.
I mean, I see this very distinctly, in talking to a lot of people, because the means testing, the paperwork shuffled, and
the humiliation of it. Yeah.
The humiliation of it. And there is a justified fear in terms of, like, for a lot of poor people, they're already afraid of the government taking away their children, their existing children. Right.
They are. But when I say backward, I mean backward in terms of educational measures, backward in terms of what their government stands for, backward in terms of
that's why I say that
it's
like, it's a leadership,
and
rather.
And also it's mobilizing.
I mean, because California is a big state. The only reason that we're remotely considered quote unquote liberal, because you go to places like Fresno or Bakersfield, it's very conservative. San Diego, relatively conservative. We just happen to have two big cities,
right? And so do we in New York,
right? So to say that, like, California is a general state is like this sophisticated state is absolutely not true. Not true at all.
One of the things I'm talking about, and at least from what I know in California as well as in New York, is people are mobilized against unjust leadership. And Mississippi has the lowest level of education, the greatest poverty, the and
And I
the
think it's
lowest
more
welfare
impoverished.
payments, and people are not mobilized. At times they have been. The South had one of the biggest movements
Right.
for tenant farmers. In the 1930s, the Communist Party organized black and white tenant farmers to rise up together, and they did, and they made some changes before they were crushed. But,
Right.
that some states have a mobilized population.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think, I think that has a lot more to do with the having cities than
Yes.
actual like being mobilized, because it's also one of those things where what has the mobilization gotten us? It's gotten us very little.
Well, I don't think so, because I think everything we've gotten, and as you said before, everything women got, they got because people were out there screaming. The
I mean,
vote and
true.
everything else,
But
and slavery.
I think there is a difference between prolonged and consistent organizing and protests. I don't look at protests as necessarily measures of change.
Well, I lived in New Haven for 38 years. And after the riots in 1968 was the first time that the government really was trying to do something about the racial injustices in that city. In fact, they cared so
Right,
much.
but there was a lot of very consistent organizing going on.
There was, and I was part of it. However,
Right.
it was only after the riots that they were serious. They were serious enough to go to the biggest, richest force, $30 billion corporation, Yale, biggest employer, negotiated directly with the Black leaders and the government to make some changes. And I do believe that peaceful mobilizations are very, very important, and organized protest. I think it made a difference that in every city, hundreds of thousands of people together were out against this threat to abortion. That has got, and I remember hearing how the war in Vietnam was ended because Nixon, looking out the window, was terrified at the mobilizations and protests of millions of people outside the window in Washington. So I do, both things have their place, but you also
Both
always
things
need
do have
consistent
their
organizing.
I'm not saying that protests are completely useless. I'm just, I come from, a generation where protests have netted a lot less results, I think, than some of the older generation.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, the all the mobilization for the Iraq war, for the Afghanistan
That was a
war,
failure.
it's done shit, right?
That's true.
It's done nothing.
It did shit. But
Right,
also,
So I'm not saying that it's useless, but that
No.
we
it's
can't.
not enough. It's not
It-
enough,
it-
obviously. But as a founding feminist, I was part of those abortion marches in Washington, and I know that made a difference. And also the anti-war movement that I was part of, wasn't the same as the anti-war in Iraq, which wasn't an ongoing threatening movement the way the war in Vietnam was, and the protests against the war. And now,
you could say that the protests against the Iraq war did do something, which is that they disenfranchised a lot of people from feeling that they could change the political landscape. So in that way, the protests work for the establishment. And again, the thing is, with all of this stuff, the story isn't over. Like, we don't know.
No.
It's like how many people were radicalized by what happened with Occupy, like around the world. It's like, okay, Occupy didn't work, but it didn't maybe work in its initial sort of intent, but it worked in waking a load of people up into things that they weren't before. So I think that it's difficult to say that these things don't work because you don't know what the consequences of them are.
That's a very important point, because look, Occupy in 2011 was really only around for 3 months, but it changed the discourse and reintroduced class. Obama had it repressed in every city simultaneously across the United States, because it did introduce the idea of the 1% and the 99%, and Americans, but 330 million of us, woke up to the concept of class. which was hugely powerful, even though occupies were all shut down. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, Bernie follows Occupy, right? Without Occupy, maybe you never got
Right.
Bernie, and we don't know what
That's
necessarily what follows Bernie or Corbyn here.
That's right.
So it's sort of an ongoing process, I guess.
Yes, it is. But people, I think that's very important. Things can have resonance way beyond what happened. But I agree that our millions of people who were protesting against the war in Iraq were not effective because we couldn't coalesce into an ongoing movement. And that was a big mistake. In New York, the demonstration was so huge that the police cars that expected 100,000 people and got a little over 1 million just gave up and left their police cars. I know, because in the dirt on the back of my windows, my sister wrote "Gay Police for Peace" on their cars, which I'm sure they would not have endorsed. But they had just abandoned them. They just abandoned their cars because they didn't know what to do.
Just to derail this, or sort of bring it back to the abortion thing. I remember when I first went to LA, sort of very bright-eyed, and just like, wow, this is the place where all these movies are made, and it was on Hollywood Boulevard, like turn the corner, and right outside one of, it's right there. Out, it wasn't quite the Chinese theater. It was one of the other ones. It was like Disney something or other, like super kid related stuff. And right outside there were all these anti-abortion protesters, and they had these huge pictures of like aborted fetuses, like fully like medicalized photos, lots of blood everywhere and gore, like designed to shock you. And I didn't do it because they were kids as well, really, the people sort of manning this stand. But I was going to go up to them and say, oh, do you have like a poster? Like how much are those? But it's just morbid. But it is powerful, that stuff, because it was quite shocking to come around the corner and see all that. And it's like, well, yeah, when you've got images like that, you can see how anyone very quickly would be anti-abortion, because it looks, it's like it's like a shit you wouldn't even see in a horror movie,
Right.
Yeah, and yet it can be refuted. I was on an abortion rights march, and there was a priest there with a picture of an aborted fetus, and he had this little holy grin on his face. And I shouted so loud, I never knew I could shout that loud. Look at the smile on his face. He must have just got sucked off by the altar boy. And then all these women applauded, and he turned purple.
Amazing.
It was cute. It was a nice moment.
That's the dark bit of all of that stuff.
Yes, it sure
that
is.
You wonder, like, when you put those pictures up for other people to look at, there's definitely something. Well, it's just something naturally perverse about it. I think that's why I wanted to go up there and be like, oh, can I buy a poster of it? Because it's great, because it's like there's some sort of twisted enjoyment, like, look, dare to stare at the truth or whatever. And it's like, well, man, you're the one carrying around those pictures all the time.
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
Exactly. Right. I think that's why that joke went over well, because the hypocrisy was so bizarre. But you do need an ongoing movement. Ikoi is right. Protests are important, but so is an ongoing movement. And I hope we do get a unified ongoing movement that will give women full rights and everyone else full rights in this country.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Sheena Belmas, Alexander Lashley, Jennifer Cox, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Bruce Rogers Vaughan.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.